Saxutorn. The blind bard's vision. The candle has burned low on your bedside table, and you've finally set aside the weight of another day. The emails answered, the decisions made, the fires extinguished. At least until morning. Your body knows it needs rest, but your mind continues its familiar dance, turning over the 1,000 details of what you're building, the endless calculations of leadership. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere else entirely, to a cottage in the Buckinghamshire countryside, where another kind of leader faced his own darkness, and found within it a vision that would illuminate the world. Picture, if you will, a study in the year 1665. Not the sterile glow of laptop screens, but the warm flicker of candlelight against oak-paneled walls. The air carries the scent of beeswax and leather-bound volumes, of ink still wet upon parchment. This is Chalfont St. Giles, and in this modest cottage, a man sits in his chair, dictating words that will echo through centuries. His name is John Milton. Perhaps you know him as the author of Paradise Lost, that towering epic of good and evil, of rebellion and redemption. But the man I want you to meet tonight is not the young firebrand who once walked the halls of Cambridge, nor the political revolutionary who defended regicide with his pen. This is Milton at 57, his hair gone silver, his face bearing the lines of a life lived fully, and his eyes, those windows to the soul, sealed forever in darkness. 7 years earlier, Milton's sight had finally abandoned him completely. It had been failing for years, a gradual dimming that no physician could halt. The man who had devoured books in multiple languages, who had traveled through Italy studying manuscripts, who had served as Latin secretary to Cromwell's government, this man now lived in a world without visual reference points. But listen carefully to what filled that void. In his study, Milton has learned to navigate by sound. The creak of the third floorboard from the window. The particular whisper that pages make when turned by different hands. The way his daughter Mary's footsteps differ from those of his nephew Edward Phillips, lighter on the stairs, more hesitant at his door. Each person who enters his world carries their own acoustic signature. The rustle of their clothing, the rhythm of their breathing, the unconscious sounds they make while thinking. The morning light that once guided his reading now serves a different purpose. He feels it warm his face through the diamond-paned windows, marking the passage of hours more reliably than any timepiece. When clouds pass overhead, he senses their shadows. When rain approaches, he smells it in the air, long before others notice the darkening sky. His fingers have become archaeologists of texture. The smooth coolness of his writing desk, worn by decades of use. The raised grain of paper made from cotton rags, each sheet slightly different under his touch. The particular weight of his walking stick, carved from ash wood, its surface polished by his palm. But it is in the realm of memory that Milton's true sight now resides. Close your eyes for a moment, as he must always do. What do you see? Not the darkness you might expect, but something far richer. Behind your closed lids live all the images you've ever absorbed. The face of someone you love. The view from a window in a place that mattered to you. The way light falls across a room at a particular time of day. For Milton, this inner landscape has become infinitely more vivid than it ever was when his outer eyes could see. In his mind's eye, he walks through the Sistine Chapel again, studying Michelangelo's frescoes with perfect recall. He revisits the gardens of Italian villas where he once debated poetry with scholars. He sees again the faces of friends long dead, the expressions of his children as infants, the play of sunlight on the Thames. But more than memory, something else stirs in that darkness, something that will transform not just his own understanding, but the very nature of English poetry. This morning, like so many others, Milton calls for his amanuensis. Today it is Thomas Elwood, a young Quaker whose careful script has already captured thousands of Milton's words. Elwood enters quietly, settling into the chair beside Milton's desk with practiced efficiency. He arranges his papers, prepares his ink, and waits. "Where did we leave off yesterday?" Milton asks, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who has learned to think before speaking, knowing that each word must be precisely chosen before it can be set down. Elwood shuffles through the pages, finding their place. "Satan's speech to his fallen legions, sir. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven." Milton nods slowly. Even in his blindness, perhaps especially because of it, he understands the weight of those words, the pride that leads to downfall, the refusal to accept limitation, the dangerous allure of absolute autonomy. How many nights have you wrestled with similar thoughts? The weight you carry as a leader sometimes feels like its own form of exile from easier paths. The responsibility that sets you apart, that makes you question every decision, that keeps you awake when others sleep soundly. Milton settles back in his chair, and something extraordinary begins to happen. His breathing deepens. His face, marked by the strain of his condition, relaxes into an expression of profound concentration. He is not merely remembering the next lines of his epic. He is seeing them unfold in real time, watching scenes play out in a theater visible only to him. "Write this," he says, and his voice takes on a different quality, as if the words are coming from somewhere beyond his conscious mind. He scarce had ceased when the superior fiend was moving toward the shore. As Elwood's pen scratches across the parchment, Milton continues, his inner vision guiding him through landscapes that exist nowhere on earth. The burning lake of hell, more vivid than any fire he witnessed with physical sight. The councils of demons, their faces more terrible and beautiful than any artist could render. The Garden of Eden, more perfect than any earthly paradise. This is the paradox that I want you to understand tonight. In losing his outer sight, Milton discovered an inner vision of unprecedented power. The very limitation that might have ended his career as a poet, instead, transformed him into something greater than he had ever been. But this transformation did not come easily. There were years of rage, of grief, of questioning why Providence had taken from him the very faculty he needed most. In one of his sonnets, written during the darkest period of his blindness, he asked whether God expected him to continue his work without the tools to perform it. "Doth God exact day labor, light denied," he wrote. The question of every leader who has faced seemingly impossible circumstances. How do you build when the foundation seems to have crumbled? How do you lead when you cannot see the path ahead? The answer came to him not through philosophical reasoning, but through surrender, through accepting that perhaps his blindness was not an obstacle to his greatest work, but the very condition that made it possible. In the silence of his darkened world, Milton could hear things that had been drowned out by the noise of sight. The rhythm of language became more important than its appearance on the page. The music of verse, the way syllables flow together, the breathing spaces between thoughts, all of this became tangible in ways that sighted poets rarely experience. Listen to how he describes the creation of light. "Let there be light, said God, and forthwith light ethereal, first of things, quintessence pure, sprung from the deep." Can you hear how the words themselves seem to shimmer? how the rhythm mimics the very emergence of illumination from darkness. This is what Milton discovered in his blindness, that true vision comes not from the eyes, but from somewhere deeper, from the place where experience and imagination meet, from the realm where limitation becomes liberation, where constraint breeds creativity. As the morning progresses in that cottage study, Milton continues his dictation, guided by an inner sight more reliable than any external vision could be. Elwood writes steadily, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly serving as the bridge between Milton's inner world and the outer realm where his words will eventually find their readers. The weight that Milton carries is different from yours, but no less real. He bears the responsibility of capturing in human language truths that seem to exist beyond language, of making visible to others the visions that have emerged from his darkness, of transforming personal limitation into universal insight. And in this transformation, there is something for every leader to understand. The obstacles that seem to block your path may actually be redirecting you toward something greater than you originally envisioned. The weight you carry may be preparing you to bear even greater responsibility. The darkness you sometimes feel may be the very condition necessary for a deeper kind of sight to emerge. As afternoon light slants through the cottage windows, Milton dismisses his amanuensis for the day. The pages covered with morning's work represent just a fragment of the vast epic taking shape in his mind. Tomorrow will bring another session, another opportunity to translate inner vision into outer word. But tonight, in the gathering darkness that for him is no different from the brightness of noon, Milton sits alone with his thoughts. The cottage settles around him with familiar sounds. Somewhere in the distance, evening birds call to one another across the fields. And in that darkness, visions continue to stir. Angels and demons, the first man and woman, the very voice of the Creator, all waiting to be given form through words, to be shared with a world that desperately needs to understand that even in the deepest darkness, even in the most complete loss, something new and beautiful can be born. Whispers in the dark, the amanuenses. But Milton did not create alone in that darkness. There were voices that came to him each morning, footsteps on the cottage path, the gentle rustle of papers being arranged on the wooden table by the window. His amanuenses, the scribes who became his hands, his connection to the written word, his bridge between the visions that blazed in his mind and the pages that would carry them to the world. You know something of this dependency, don't you? The weight you carry requires others to bear fruit. The ideas that keep you awake, the strategies that form in the quiet hours, they need hands other than your own to become real. Milton understood this completely. He had learned that greatness is never a solitary achievement. In the morning light, filtering through those cottage windows, we might have witnessed one of the most extraordinary creative partnerships in literary history. Picture the scene. Milton seated in his chair, perhaps still in his nightgown, having woken with lines already forming in his mind. The soft knock at the door, the careful entrance of his scribe, moving quietly so as not to disturb the poet's concentration. These were not mere secretaries. They were collaborators in the truest sense, though history has largely forgotten their names. They learned to read Milton's moods, to sense when the words were flowing and when they had dried up. They developed an almost telepathic understanding of his rhythms, his pauses, his need for silence, to let a particularly complex passage settle in his mind before continuing. The primary amanuensis during these crucial years was likely Thomas Elwood, a young Quaker who had come to Milton seeking education and remained to become something far more valuable, a literary partner. Elwood was gentle, patient, possessed of a beautiful hand and an ear for the music of language. He would arrive each morning with fresh quills, good paper, and a mind prepared to receive whatever visions Milton had carried through the night. Listen to the sounds of their work together. The scratch of the quill against parchment, steady and rhythmic. Milton's voice, measured and sonorous, speaking lines that seemed to come from some divine source. Of man's first disobedience, and the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe. Elwood's hand moves across the page, capturing not just words, but the very cadence of creation. When Milton pauses, the young man waits, quill poised, understanding that silence is part of the process. These are not mere dictation sessions. They are acts of translation, bringing the ineffable into the realm of human language. Sometimes Milton would stop mid-line, his face troubled. No, no, strike that. The rhythm is wrong. And Elwood would carefully cross out the offending passage, waiting as Milton worked through the problem in his mind, testing different words, different arrangements, until the music was right. The poet was exacting, demanding perfection not from vanity, but from a deep understanding that the words he was crafting would outlive them both. You understand this pursuit of excellence, don't you? The way you refine and refine again, knowing that what you're building must be strong enough to withstand the storms ahead. Milton's standards were uncompromising because he knew he was creating something that would speak across centuries. But there was another presence in that cottage, one that brought a different kind of support to the blind poet's work. Elizabeth Minshall had come into Milton's life as his third wife in 1663, when he was 54, and she barely half his age. Yet their partnership transcended the conventional arrangements of the time. Elizabeth became not just a wife, but a guardian of the work, a protector of the creative process. She understood that her husband's blindness made him vulnerable in ways that went beyond the physical. In a world where written contracts and correspondence governed everything, Milton was dependent on others not just for creation, but for survival. Elizabeth learned to read the letters that arrived, to manage the household accounts, to shield her husband from the daily intrusions that could fragment his concentration. More than this, she became another voice in the cottage, another pair of hands for the great work. When Elwood was unavailable, Elizabeth would take up the quill. Her handwriting was different, more delicate perhaps, but no less committed to capturing every nuance of her husband's vision. She learned to anticipate his needs, to have fresh paper ready, to maintain the supplies that kept the work flowing. There were moments of profound intimacy in this arrangement. Picture Elizabeth in the evening, reading back the day's work to Milton by candlelight, her voice giving life to the words he had spoken hours before, allowing him to hear them fresh, to catch rhythms that needed adjustment, images that could be sharpened. These were not just proofreading sessions, but acts of love. A wife helping her husband hear his own genius reflected back to him. Milton would sit listening, his sightless eyes closed, his head tilted slightly as he concentrated on every syllable. Sometimes he would nod approvingly. Other times he would interrupt. There, that passage about the fallen angels. Read it again, more slowly. And Elizabeth would comply, her voice becoming an instrument of revision, helping Milton refine his masterpiece line by line. The trust required for such collaboration was extraordinary. Milton was placing his life's work, his reputation, his very legacy into the hands of others. Every word of Paradise Lost passed through other voices before reaching the page. Every revision depended on others understanding not just what he said, but what he meant. This was vulnerability on a scale that few creators ever experience. Yet it was also liberation. Freed from the mechanics of writing, Milton could focus entirely on the act of creation. His mind could soar through the cosmos he was building, following Satan's fall through the void, witnessing the first dawn in Eden, hearing the very voice of God without being anchored to earth by the need to form letters on a page. The amanuenses became extensions of Milton's will, his instruments of creation. But they were more than that. They were witnesses to genius in action, present for the birth of lines that would echo through literature for centuries. They heard Paradise Lost before anyone else, experienced its power in its most raw and immediate form. Think of Elwood's amazement as Milton dictated Satan's great soliloquy. Better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Or Elizabeth's quiet awe as she wrote down the description of Adam and Eve in their innocence. These scribes were the first audience for one of the greatest works in the English language, privileged to see how immortal art emerges from the marriage of vision and craft. They learned, too, that genius is not a constant flame, but something that flickers and flows. There were mornings when Milton had little to dictate, when the well seemed dry. The amanuenses learned to wait patiently, to trust that the vision would return. They witnessed the full humanity of their employer, his frustrations, his moments of doubt, his occasional despair that the work would never be completed. But they also witnessed his resilience. Day after day, Milton returned to the work. Day after day, the amanuenses returned to their posts, ready to capture whatever emerged from the darkness of his blindness and transform it into light on the page. In those quiet cottage rooms, surrounded by the sounds of rural England, one of literature's greatest collaborations unfolded. Not just between Milton and his muse, but between a blind poet and the devoted hands that made his vision real. Together, they proved that the most profound act of leadership is knowing when to depend on others. And the most profound act of service is becoming the instrument through which another's greatness can reach the world. London's shifting sands, the Restoration. But even as this remarkable partnership flourished in the peaceful countryside, the world beyond Chalfont St. Giles was shifting beneath their feet like sand in an hourglass. The year was 1660, and across England, everything Milton had believed in, everything he had worked for, was about to be swept away by forces far beyond his control. You know this feeling, don't you? That moment when the market shifts overnight, when regulations change, when the very ground rules of your industry are rewritten by powers you cannot influence. The weight you carry suddenly feels heavier because the foundation beneath it has become uncertain. In London, church bells were ringing, not in mourning, but in celebration. Charles II had returned from exile, and the monarchy was restored. The Commonwealth that Milton had served so faithfully, the republican ideals he had defended with his pen and his position, had crumbled like autumn leaves. Oliver Cromwell was dead, his body exhumed and posthumously executed in a grotesque display of royal vengeance. The city that had once embraced radical thinking now thronged with royalist supporters. Bonfires lit the night sky, not with the warm glow of progress, but with the harsh flames of retribution. Books were burned in the streets, Republican pamphlets, treatises on liberty, works that had dared to question the divine right of kings. Among them, copies of Milton's own writings. Picture the scene for a moment. Narrow London streets filled with crowds, their faces lit by flickering flames, the acrid smell of burning paper mixing with the Thames fog. And somewhere in that smoke, the words Milton had crafted so carefully. His arguments for press freedom, his defense of regicide, his passionate pleas for a government of the people, all turning to ash and memory. This was not merely political change. This was the complete inversion of everything Milton had believed possible for England. The revolution he had supported hadn't just failed. It had been erased, condemned, made treasonous by royal decree. From his cottage retreat, Milton could only listen as his amanuenses brought him news from London. Each report must have felt like a physical blow. Former colleagues arrested, Republican leaders executed. The very ideals he had spent his sight defending now branded as crimes against the crown. But here's what strikes me most about this moment. Milton didn't flee. He didn't burn his manuscripts or deny his past. Even as friends urged him to escape to the continent, even as the net of royal justice tightened around former Commonwealth officials, he remained. Not out of stubbornness, but out of something deeper. The quiet courage that comes from knowing your work transcends the immediate crisis. You understand this, don't you? That moment when everything you've built seems threatened. When the world tells you your vision was wrong, your efforts wasted. The temptation to abandon ship, to start over somewhere else with a clean slate. But something inside whispers, not yet. Not while there's still work to be done. It was during these dark weeks that Andrew Marvell entered Milton's story. Marvell was a poet himself, but more importantly for Milton's survival, he was a politician with a gift for navigating treacherous waters. Where Milton was uncompromising in his principles, Marvell understood the art of strategic flexibility. Where Milton saw the world in terms of right and wrong, Marvell saw the subtle shades of gray that make survival possible. Marvell had served in Cromwell's government alongside Milton, but he possessed something his blind friend lacked: the ability to read the changing political winds and adjust his sails accordingly. He had managed to secure a seat in the new Parliament, walking the delicate line between his Republican past and Royalist present. When word reached him that Milton's name appeared on lists of those marked for arrest, Marvell didn't hesitate. He used his influence, called in favors, worked behind the scenes with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood that sometimes the greatest acts of friendship happen in shadows. The exact details of what Marvell did remain lost to history. We know he spoke to influential figures, perhaps even to the king himself. We know he argued that Milton, now blind and living in rural obscurity, posed no threat to the restored monarchy. We know he emphasized the poet's literary achievements over his political writings. But I suspect the real power of Marvell's intervention lay in something more subtle. He understood that mercy, strategically applied, could serve the new regime better than wholesale vengeance. A blind poet, pardoned and forgotten, demonstrated royal magnanimity. A blind poet, executed or exiled, might become a martyr for Republican ideals. Think about the delicate balance Marvell had to maintain. Too forceful an advocacy for Milton might have aroused suspicion about his own loyalties. Too little effort might have cost his friend his life. It required the kind of nuanced judgment that comes from understanding not just what needs to be done, but how it needs to be done, and by whom. This is leadership of a different kind than Milton's passionate advocacy or his unwavering principles. This is the leadership of the fixer, the diplomat, the person who works in the spaces between official positions. No less valuable, no less courageous in its own way. While Marvell worked his quiet magic in London's corridors of power, Milton waited in Chalfont St. Giles. The waiting must have been excruciating. Each day brought the possibility of soldiers at his door, of arrest, of trial for treason. Yet he continued his work on Paradise Lost, dictating lines about rebellion and redemption while his own fate hung in the balance. There's something profoundly moving about this image: a blind man, politically defeated, personally vulnerable, yet still believing that words mattered enough to continue crafting them with infinite care, still trusting that what he was building would outlast the immediate crisis. The pardon, when it came, was almost anticlimactic, a name quietly removed from a list. No fanfare, no public ceremony, just the simple bureaucratic act that meant Milton could continue breathing, continue working, continue hoping. But behind that quiet administrative decision lay Marvel's careful orchestration, his understanding that sometimes salvation comes not through grand gestures, but through patient, invisible work. As summer turned to autumn in 1660, Milton prepared to return to London. The city he would find was not the one he had left. The coffee-houses buzzed with different conversations now. The bookshops displayed different works. The very air seemed charged with a different energy. Not the revolutionary fervor of the Commonwealth years, but the cautious optimism of a nation trying to heal its wounds. Yet Milton carried with him something the changing political winds could not touch. In his mind, carefully preserved and constantly refined, lived the opening books of Paradise Lost, a work that would transform personal darkness into universal light, political defeat into spiritual triumph, the loss of one paradise into the promise of another. The weight he carried had not diminished. If anything, it had grown heavier with the knowledge of how quickly human institutions could crumble. But he had learned something invaluable during those uncertain months, that what you're building, if it's built to last, must be founded on something deeper than political success or social approval. Coffeehouse Conversations, Seeds of Rebellion. The foundations Milton spoke of. They were not built in the quiet of Chalfont St. Giles alone. They were forged in the most unlikely of places, in the bustling, smoke-filled coffee-houses of Restoration London, where ideas bubbled and steamed like the dark brew that gave these establishments their name. You know this feeling, don't you? When the work becomes too solitary, when the weight you carry feels too heavy to bear alone, there comes a moment when you must venture out, seek the company of minds that understand the magnitude of what you're attempting to build. For Milton, nearly blind now, navigating by sound and memory through London's narrow streets, these coffee-houses became his parliament, his university, his refuge. The year was 1663, and London pulsed with a strange energy. On the surface, Charles II's court celebrated its restoration with elaborate pageantry and carefully orchestrated joy. But beneath, in the dim corners of establishments like the Grecian Coffee House near the Temple or the Rainbow in Fleet Street, a different conversation was taking place. Picture Milton, if you will, guided by Thomas Elwood or another trusted companion, making his way through the maze of wooden tables and tobacco smoke. His blindness, which might have isolated another man, became his passport into these circles of dissent. There's something about speaking with someone who cannot see you that strips away pretense, makes conversation more honest, more direct. The coffee house was democracy in its rawest form. A penny bought you not just a cup of that bitter, energizing liquid from distant lands, but entry into debates that would have been treason in any other setting. Merchants sat beside poets, physicians argued with pamphlet writers, and former parliamentarians, men like Milton, who had served Cromwell's republic, found themselves in the strange position of critiquing the very monarchy they were supposed to celebrate. The question, Milton would say, his voice carrying that distinctive authority that comes from having lived through the collapse of everything you believed in, is not whether kings have the right to rule, but whether any man has the right to demand another's absolute submission. These words, spoken in the relative safety of coffee-scented shadows, carried dangerous implications. Around him, conversations would pause, not in fear, but in recognition. Here was someone articulating what many felt, but dared not voice. You understand this dynamic, don't you? In the work you do, the changes you're trying to create. There are always those moments when you must speak truths that others find uncomfortable. When what you're building challenges not just competitors, but entire ways of thinking. The coffee houses gave Milton something precious. They gave him an audience for ideas too radical for print, too dangerous for formal publication. Here, he could test the themes that would later thunder through Paradise Lost: the nature of authority, the price of obedience, the terrible, beautiful burden of choice. Consider Satan, he might say, leaning forward across a scarred wooden table, his blind eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. Not as mere villain, but as the first revolutionary, the first being to look at absolute power and say, "No, I will not submit." The conversations that followed these provocations, they were electric, dangerous, exhilarating. Men who had fought in civil wars, who had seen kings executed and republics born and die, found themselves grappling with questions that went to the very heart of human existence. Was rebellion always evil? Could there be such a thing as righteous disobedience? If God himself could be questioned, what did that mean for earthly kings who claimed divine right? These were not abstract philosophical debates. Every man in those coffee houses lived under a restored monarchy that had already executed some of its enemies and pardoned others seemingly at random. The weight they carried was not just intellectual, it was existential. Milton's presence in these spaces was both inspiration and warning. Here was a man who had argued for regicide in print, who had served as Latin secretary to a republic that had shaken Europe's foundations. By all rights, he should have been dead or in the tower. Instead, he sat among them, blind but unbroken, his mind sharper than ever. The greatest tyranny, he would observe, stirring his coffee with deliberate care, is not the tyranny of kings over subjects, but the tyranny of unexamined assumptions over the human mind. This was the seed of everything. Not just Paradise Lost, but a way of thinking that would echo through centuries of revolution and reform. The idea that questioning authority, even divine authority, was not just permissible, but necessary. The young men who gathered around these tables, hanging on every word, would carry these conversations into their own work. Some would become writers themselves, others merchants or lawyers or physicians, but all would remember the blind poet who taught them that true rebellion began not with swords or cannons, but with the courage to think forbidden thoughts. As evening fell and the coffee houses emptied, Milton would make his careful way home through London's twisting streets. The conversations of the day would settle in his mind like sediment in still water, clarifying into the crystalline verses he would dictate the following morning. This was how Paradise Lost was really written, not in solitary genius, but in the dynamic tension between private contemplation and public discourse, between the safety of Chalfont St. Urtu, Giles, and the electric danger of London's intellectual underground. The weight you carry in your own work. It's similar, isn't it? The isolation of leadership, broken by moments of connection with others who understand the magnitude of what you're attempting. The way ideas that seem impossible in isolation suddenly become inevitable when shared with the right minds at the right moment. Milton understood something crucial about the relationship between creation and community. That the most radical ideas need testing grounds, spaces where they can be challenged, refined, strengthened before they face the wider world. In those coffee houses, surrounded by the smell of tobacco and the sound of passionate argument, Milton was not just preparing to write the greatest epic in English literature, He was participating in the birth of something larger, a new way of thinking about power, authority, and the individual's relationship to both. The seeds of rebellion he planted in those conversations would bloom not just in Paradise Lost, but in the minds of everyone who heard them. Ideas, once released, have their own momentum, their own power to transform the world. And perhaps that's what sustained him through the long nights of composition that lay ahead. The knowledge that what he was building was not just personal expression, but part of a larger conversation, one that began in the coffee houses of Restoration London and continues wherever people gather to question, to challenge, to imagine better ways of being human. The weight he carried was no longer his alone. It had become part of something larger, something that would outlast kings and republics alike. Inner landscapes, the world within. But to understand how Milton transformed that collective weight into something transcendent, we must step into the world he could no longer see, yet knew more intimately than any sighted person ever could. In the garden at Chalfont St. Giles, Elizabeth Minshall had planted herbs along the path Milton walked each morning, not for decoration, but as landmarks for a man navigating by touch and scent. The sharp brightness of rosemary marked the turn toward the orchard. The soft earthiness of thyme told him he was halfway to his favorite bench. The sweet, almost honeyed fragrance of lavender meant he had reached the place where he did his deepest thinking. These were not merely pleasant scents to Milton. They had become the architecture of his inner world, the foundation stones upon which he built entire universes. You know this process, don't you? The way certain sensations anchor us when everything else feels uncertain. The particular weight of your favorite pen in your hand during difficult negotiations. The specific sound your office door makes when you close it for those moments when you need to think clearly. The taste of that first coffee in the morning before the day's demands crowd in. For Milton, deprived of sight, these remaining senses had sharpened into something almost supernatural. When he described the Garden of Eden in Paradise Lost, the flowers of all hue, and without thorn, the rose. He was drawing not from memory of what he had once seen, but from the living library of sensation that surrounded him daily. Listen to how he captures the morning in Paradise. Now came still evening on, and twilight gray had in her sober livery all things clad. Silence accompanied, for beast and bird, they to their grassy couch, these to their nests, were slunk, all but the wakeful nightingale. Every word chosen not for its visual impact, but for its music, its texture on the tongue, its ability to conjure feeling rather than mere image. The nightingale that sang outside his window at Chalfont had become the voice of paradise itself. The way the evening air cooled his skin as he sat in the garden had taught him how to describe the perfect temperature of Eden. The sound of Elizabeth's skirts rustling as she moved through the house had shown him how to give voice to the whisper of angel wings. This is what happens when we stop trying to see everything and begin to truly perceive what surrounds us. Modern science has a term for what Milton experienced: synesthesia. The blending of senses, where sound might have color, or touch might have taste. But Milton's condition was perhaps even more remarkable. The way loss of one sense had awakened the others to extraordinary sensitivity. He could hear the difference between morning light and afternoon light. Not see it, but hear it in the way sounds carried differently through air of different temperatures. He could feel the approach of weather changes in the subtle shifts of air pressure against his skin. He could taste the seasons in the water from his well, as underground streams shifted with the rains. These weren't compensations for blindness. They were discoveries of capacities that had always existed, but had been overshadowed by the tyranny of sight. Think about the moments in your own leadership when you've had to navigate without clear vision, when the market data was contradictory, the advice conflicting, the path forward anything but obvious. In those moments, what guided you? Was it not something more subtle than mere analysis? Some inner compass that drew on senses you rarely acknowledge? Milton's daily walks along the Thames became journeys into sound itself. The river spoke to him in a dozen different voices. The gentle lap against the muddy banks at low tide. The urgent rush when the waters ran high after storms. He learned to read the river's moods like a text, understanding when merchant vessels were approaching by the particular way their wake disturbed the natural rhythm of the water. And in those sounds, he found the music of Paradise Lost, the iambic pentameter that carries his epic forward. It moves like water, doesn't it? Like the Thames itself, sometimes gentle, sometimes urgent, but always flowing toward something larger than itself. The mind is its own place, he wrote, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. But for Milton, the mind was never separate from the body that housed it. Every sensation became raw material for imagination. The warmth of sun through his study window transformed into the light that blazes from the throne of God. The cool touch of morning dew on grass he could no longer see became the tears of Adam and Eve as they leave paradise. Elizabeth would often find him in the garden at dawn, standing perfectly still among her flowers, his head tilted as if listening to something she could not hear. And perhaps he was, listening to the conversation between earth and air, between growing things and the light that fed them, between the world as it is and the world as it might be. This was not the romantic notion of the blind man whose other senses compensate for his loss. This was something far more profound, the discovery that reality itself is far richer, far more layered than our eyes alone can ever reveal. When you're building something that matters, when you're carrying the weight of other people's livelihoods, other people's dreams, you need more than vision in the conventional sense. You need the ability to sense currents that don't show up in spreadsheets, to hear the music in conversations that seem like mere noise, to feel the texture of trust, the temperature of loyalty, the weight of genuine commitment. Milton's blindness had taught him that the most important landscapes are internal ones, that paradise and hell are not places we might someday visit, but territories we inhabit every day, depending on how we choose to perceive and respond to what surrounds us. In his study, dictating to Elizabeth or Thomas, he would sometimes pause mid-sentence, his hand moving slightly as if he were touching something invisible. Those who worked with him learned to wait during these moments, understanding that he was not stuck, but exploring, following some inner path that would eventually lead to exactly the words he needed. The epic he was creating was not just about the fall of man, or the rebellion of Satan, or the mercy of God. It was about the infinite worlds that exist within consciousness itself, the way a single human mind, properly attuned, can contain multitudes. And in those quiet moments in his garden, surrounded by the architecture of scent and sound that had replaced the world of sight, Milton discovered that the universe he was building in his imagination was not smaller than the one he had lost. It was immeasurably larger. The weight he carried had become something different now. Not the burden of blindness, not even the responsibility of preserving dangerous truths in dangerous times, but the joyful weight of creation itself. The knowledge that every sensation, every moment of attention, every careful choice of word and rhythm was adding another stone to a structure that would outlast empires. A textured world, reading without sight. The weight he carried had become something different now, Not the burden of blindness, not even the responsibility of preserving dangerous truths in dangerous times, but the joyful weight of creation itself. The knowledge that every sensation, every moment of attention, every careful choice of word and rhythm was adding another stone to a structure that would outlast empires. But how does one build such a structure when the very tools of construction have changed so fundamentally? In those quiet hours at Chalfont St. Giles, when the morning light filtered through windows he could no longer see, Milton was developing something remarkable. Not just the ability to compose without sight, but entirely new ways of engaging with the written word itself. Consider this for a moment. You who carry the weight of building something meaningful. You know how essential it is to absorb information, to learn from what others have written, to build upon the foundations laid by those who came before. But what happens when the conventional pathways to knowledge are severed? Milton's fingers had become his eyes in ways we can barely imagine. There were no raised dots yet, no systematic method of tactile reading. But there was ingenuity born of necessity. Letters carved deep into wood, words pressed into soft clay that his fingertips could trace like ancient cuneiform. His daughters, those patient amanuenses, would sometimes take his hand and guide it over the shapes of letters, helping him feel the architecture of language itself. But perhaps more remarkable still was what happened inside his mind. Memory, that most ancient of human technologies, became his library. Not just the ability to recall, but to organize, to cross-reference, to hold entire passages in perfect suspension while composing new ones. Milton's mind had become a cathedral of stored knowledge. Each verse and chapter filed away in mental alcoves he could visit at will. Think of the discipline this required, the patience. When you lie awake at 2 a.m., mind racing through the challenges ahead. Imagine if every piece of information you needed was stored not on your phone, not in files or documents, but entirely within the careful architecture of your own memory. Every classical reference, every biblical verse, every line of poetry that had ever moved him. All of it organized and accessible through pure mental discipline. His amanuenses would often describe watching him work, how he would sit in perfect stillness for what seemed like hours, his sightless eyes turned toward some inner horizon. They learned to recognize the signs, the slight shift in posture that meant he was ready to speak, the particular quality of attention that preceded the emergence of verse. "Ready?" Elizabeth would ask quietly, her pen poised above the paper. And then it would come. Not haltingly, not with the stops and starts you might expect, but in flowing passages that seemed to emerge fully formed from some deep creative well. Lines that would later move readers to tears, concepts that would reshape how humanity understood rebellion and redemption and the terrible beauty of free will. All of it spoken into existence in a cottage study, translated from inner vision to written word through the patient collaboration between poet and scribe. But the process was more intricate than simple dictation. Milton had developed what we might call a tactile relationship with his own work. After Elizabeth or Thomas had written out a passage, they would read it back to him, but not just once, multiple times, with different emphasis, different rhythms. He was listening not just to the meaning but to the music, the way each line would feel in a reader's mouth, the way the syllables would create their own momentum. Sometimes he would ask them to trace letters in the air while they read, his eyes following the invisible shapes their hands described. Other times, he would request that they write individual words on separate pieces of paper, then arrange and rearrange them physically on the table while he listened to the different combinations, feeling out the perfect sequence through sound and rhythm alone. The weight of creation, you see, had become a collaborative burden in the most beautiful sense. Not the loneliness of the isolated genius, but the profound intimacy of shared purpose. His amanuenses weren't merely transcribing, they were participating in the birth of something eternal. And there were moments, Elizabeth would later describe them, when the process felt almost mystical. When Milton would suddenly stop mid-sentence, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. The room would fall silent except for the scratch of pen on paper, the distant sound of birds in the garden, the whisper of pages turning. "Do you hear that?" he would sometimes ask. They would listen, hear nothing but the ordinary sounds of an English afternoon. "The rhythm," he would explain. "It's not quite right yet. The line wants to breathe differently." And then would come the revision. The careful adjustment of a single syllable that would transform the entire passage, like tuning a string that brings a whole instrument into harmony. This was patience of a different order than anything demanded in our age of instant revision and endless editing. Each change required not just thought, but the physical act of rewriting, the investment of time and paper and ink. Every revision was a commitment, every word, choice a small act of faith in the larger vision. You who build something meaningful in your own time, you understand this weight, the knowledge that every decision, every careful choice, every moment of patient attention is either adding to or subtracting from what you're creating. But imagine carrying that weight without the ability to see your progress, to scan quickly through what you've built, to make those rapid adjustments that modern tools allow. Milton's progress was measured differently, in the quality of silence that followed each completed passage, in the way his amanuenses would pause, pen suspended above paper, when they sensed they had just captured something extraordinary, in the gradual accumulation of pages that represented not just work completed, but an inner world made manifest through the most unlikely of circumstances. The cottage at Chalfont St. Giles had become something unique in literary history, a place where blindness had been transformed into vision, where limitation had become liberation, where the ancient art of memory had been wedded to the emerging possibilities of collaborative creation. And in the growing stack of manuscript pages, something was taking shape that would outlast kingdoms, that would speak to rebels and rulers alike, that would prove that the greatest monuments are built not from stone, but from the careful arrangement of words that capture the full complexity of what it means to be human. The weight Milton carried was becoming something the world would carry too, a gift born from darkness, shaped by patience, and made possible by the profound trust between one man's vision and another's faithful hands. Paradise found. The legacy. The manuscript was complete. After years of patient dictation, careful revision, and the quiet faith of hands that captured his vision, Paradise Lost was ready to meet the world. In 1667, the poem emerged from Milton's cottage like dawn breaking over ancient hills, 12 books of blank verse that would reshape how humanity understood itself, its origins, its choices, and the weight of consequence that follows every decision we make. The first readers approached it cautiously. This was not the poetry they expected. No rhyming couplets to guide them along familiar paths. Instead, Milton had chosen the freedom of unrhymed verse, the same freedom he had fought for in the political realm, now expressed in the very structure of his language. Some found it difficult. The syntax twisted and turned like the labyrinthine paths of Eden itself. But those who persevered discovered something extraordinary. Here was Satan, not as a simple villain, but as a figure of tragic complexity. A leader who had chosen rebellion over submission, who declared it better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. You know that tension, don't you? the weight of decisions that define not just your success, but your very character. Milton understood that the greatest battles are fought not in boardrooms or battlefields, but in the quiet moments when we choose who we will become. Paradise Lost became more than a retelling of humanity's fall. It became a meditation on leadership itself, on the burden of choice, on what happens when we must act without certainty, when the path forward is shrouded in darkness, when the consequences of our decisions will ripple far beyond our own lives. Milton's Adam and Eve face the ultimate entrepreneurial moment. They have been given everything: a perfect world, clear guidance, unlimited potential. But they also possess something that makes them human: the freedom to choose differently, the capacity to risk everything for the possibility of something more. Their fall is not just theological, it is profoundly human. It speaks to every leader who has stood at the crossroads between safety and possibility, between the known path and the uncertain venture that might change everything. But Milton's genius lay in showing us that even in failure, even in the consequences of our choices, there remains something indestructible in the human spirit. Adam and Eve leave paradise. Yes, but they leave together. They face an uncertain world, but they face it with knowledge, with experience, with the hard-won wisdom that comes from understanding both triumph and loss. The poem's influence spread like ripples across still water. William Blake would later declare that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it, recognizing how the poet had made rebellion and questioning authority seem almost noble. The Romantic poets found in Paradise Lost a celebration of individual will, of the power to shape one's own destiny even in the face of cosmic forces. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Milton's great work lies in what it teaches us about resilience. Here was a man who had lost his sight, his political cause, his certainty about the future. Yet from that darkness, he created something that continues to illuminate the human condition centuries later. The weight you carry, the impossible decisions, the nights when you lie awake wondering if you've chosen correctly. Milton knew all of this. He transformed his own struggles into a work that speaks to every generation of leaders who must navigate between competing values, who must make choices without perfect information, who must carry the responsibility for others, even when the path ahead is unclear. Paradise Lost reminds us that leadership is not about avoiding difficult choices, but about facing them with courage and wisdom. It is about understanding that our decisions have consequences, but also that we possess something remarkable: the capacity to learn, to adapt, to find meaning even in our mistakes. The poem's final image is not of despair, but of quiet hope. Adam and Eve, hand in hand, walking into an uncertain world, but walking forward nonetheless. They carry with them the knowledge of what they have lost, but also the potential for what they might yet build. This is Milton's ultimate gift to those who lead: the understanding that setbacks are not endings, that failure can become the foundation for something greater, that the very struggles that seem to diminish us can become the source of our greatest strength. As you lie here now, feeling the weight of what you're building, remember Milton's patient faith. Remember how he trusted that his words would find their way to those who needed them. How he believed that truth spoken in darkness would eventually find the light. Your own work, the vision you carry, the people you serve, all of this is part of a larger story. A story that began in a cottage in Chalfont, St. Giles, where a blind man and his faithful amanuenses proved that the human spirit, properly guided, can create something that outlasts empires, something that speaks across centuries, something that transforms limitation into liberation. The darkness you sometimes feel, Milton knew it too, but he also knew that darkness, when met with patience and purpose, can become the very place where our greatest work begins. Echoes of light, a final rest, and so we return to that cottage in Chalfont St. Giles, where our story began. The fire has burned low in the grate. The last pages have been dictated, and John Milton sits in his familiar chair, surrounded by the profound silence that has become his companion. But it is not empty silence. It is the silence of completion, the quiet that follows when something eternal has been brought into the world. The weight you carry tonight. Milton carried it too. The impossible decisions, the moments when everything seemed to hang by a thread. The dark hours when you wondered if what you're building would survive the storms ahead. He knew that weight intimately, felt it pressing down through years of political upheaval, through the loss of sight, through the fear that his life's work might die with him. But here, in this peaceful room, surrounded by the manuscripts that would outlive kings and empires, Milton discovered something profound. The work itself, when it springs from genuine purpose, carries its own light forward. What you're building, the vision you hold, the changes you're trying to create, they have their own momentum, their own power to endure beyond the immediate struggles that consume your days. Think of Thomas Elwood, sitting beside Milton in these final months, watching the old poet's face as he spoke those last revisions to Paradise Lost. Elwood saw something remarkable, the way Milton's expression grew peaceful, almost luminous, as he released each line into the world. There was no grasping, no desperate clinging to control, only the quiet satisfaction of having given everything he had to give. This is the final lesson Milton offers to those who lead, to those who create, to those who carry the weight of building something meaningful. There comes a moment when you must trust that what you've poured your life into will find its own way forward. The vision you've nurtured, the team you've built, the changes you've set in motion. They have taken on a life of their own. Milton's blindness, which once seemed like the end of everything, had become the very condition that allowed him to see most clearly. In losing his physical sight, he gained something far more valuable: the ability to perceive the deeper currents that move through human experience, the eternal patterns that connect all our struggles, all our hopes, all our attempts to build something lasting in a world of constant change. The coffeehouse conversations, the dangerous ideas about freedom and authority, the quiet heroism of friends like Andrew Marvell, the patient collaboration with his amanuenses, all of it wove together into something larger than any single thread. Milton's life became a testament to the power of persistence, of finding allies in unexpected places, of transforming every limitation into a new form of strength. And when Paradise Lost finally appeared in the world, when readers first encountered those opening lines about things unattempted yet in prose or rhyme, they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the work of a blind poet, but the culmination of everything he had learned about leadership, about resilience, about the courage required to keep building even when the outcome remains uncertain. Tonight, as you finally allow your mind to settle, remember that your story too is part of something larger. The challenges that feel so overwhelming, the decisions that keep you awake, the weight of responsibility that never quite lifts. These are not burdens to be endured alone. They are the very materials from which lasting change is built. The raw substance of transformation, the darkness from which new light emerges. Milton knew this truth in his bones, felt it in every line he dictated, every revision he considered, every moment of doubt he pushed through. The work you're doing, the vision you're pursuing, the better world you're trying to create. It matters more than you know, reaches further than you can see, touches lives in ways that will only become clear with time. The cottage grows quiet now. The fire settles into glowing embers, and somewhere in that peaceful silence, Milton's voice continues, not as memory, not as echo, but as living presence, reminding all who struggle with the weight of leadership that darkness, when met with patience and purpose and the quiet determination to keep building, always, always gives way to light.